Hi, everyone. This example will walk through externalities and the concept of social loss and also how to measure it. So suppose that your prompt is this. Use these axes to draw the graph of the externality produced by deworming drugs for school children in Kenya. Clearly label the marginal cost curve, the private marginal benefit curve, and the social marginal benefit curve. Assume a standard marginal curve. In other words, generally upward sloping. Well, we know that the marginal cost curve is equal to the or is synonymous with the supply curve because it communicates the marginal cost at every particular quantity. Same thing with the marginal benefit curve. That's going to be your demand curve. Marginal benefit is demand. Those communicate the same things. But step one is to remember that when you're thinking about externalities, there's going to be some kind of a gap between the quantity that society would want and the quantity that the private market reaches all by itself. So externalities have spillover benefits or spillover costs that go to third parties that are not part of the transaction. And that means that private actors are collectively going to arrive at a quantity that's either too low in the case of a positive externality or too high in the case of a negative externality. So the second step there is, since we know that there will be this gap between private and social, here with this prompt, use your clinical or policy or general understanding of what's going on here. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? This is a drug that reduces parasites. So I think it's probably reasonable to assume that this is going to be something that's beneficial. So in this case, think about what that's going to mean for whether quantity private will be larger or smaller than quantity social. Step three, plot the private market. This is fairly straightforward. Let's start with the easiest thing. The marginal cost curve should look pretty familiar. It should look like a pretty standard supply curve at this point. Assume a standard marginal cost curve is part of the prompt, and so this is about as easy as it gets. Next step, add in the private market. Again, this is fairly straightforward. That should look an awful lot like fairly familiar demand curves that we've seen lots and lots of times. So that's the first step. And now, actually, let me back up. Yeah, step zero. Don't panic. You can do this. This is actually not too hard. You can reason your way through it. So step four, add the social curve. Now here's where it's helpful to think about, is this going to be is this a good thing or a bad thing, sort of colloquially speaking? So is this going to have, is this a product or a service where we want to see more of it or we want to see less of it? In this case, since it's doing something that's beneficial and reduces the risk of additional spread of parasites, it's something that's going to be good. And so the social benefit is going to exceed the private benefit. That's why the social curve is plotted to the right. Don't forget to identify and label the quantities so that you know what Q private is and what Q social is. Those are going to be very important. So anytime, this is where the market will reach equilibrium for the private market because marginal costs are equal to the marginal benefit up at this point. But beyond this point, the marginal cost is higher than the private benefit. And that's always the decision point. If marginal costs exceed marginal benefit for this particular unit, you don't consume it. The next step is to identify total social welfare at each quantity. Total social welfare at each quantity. I'm emphasizing the word social because that's important to calculating externalities. So what I've plotted here, these are fairly familiar. This upper one is consumer surplus, as you know, and this bottom one is producer surplus. That's what you'd find in the private market. Those represent the private benefit and the private consumer benefit and the private producer benefit. But don't forget that when you're dealing with externalities, society gets the benefits of all of the quantities that are consumed, or in the case of a negative externality, it gets all of the costs of the quantities that are consumed. So if I get a vaccination, it helps me, which is shown by this value on the private curve. So I value this vaccine, let's say at $10, but it helps society by an additional amount, maybe all the way up to $14. So think about the quantity, and then see what the total social benefit is. You don't want to forget about this part. So this is consuming this quantity involves, even though the private curve is a lot lower, the total social curve is still this high. So every unit that gets consumed all the way up until this point, society does get to reap the benefits of each of those. So this you could see, this, I guess, what is this, a trapezoid all in? The trapezoid is actually the total welfare to society when society consumes Q star number of these deworming drugs. So I'm going to put that into, I'm going to put that outlined in orange just to make it a little clearer for the next step. Okay. Now we want to find out what's the total social welfare at quantity Q star. Well, this is a fairly standard operation. So for this total social welfare associated with Q star social, let's just sort of temporarily ignore the marginal benefit private curve and look at what the equilibrium would be. So we know what the equilibrium would be in quantity, and then we know what the equilibrium price would be as well. There are no numbers given, so it's just purely representational, but if there were numbers, you could figure that out. And so we know how to plot, we know how to calculate producer surplus and consumer surplus in this context. It looks just like that. And so at Q star, at Q star social, we know that this is the total consumer surplus, and this is the total producer surplus. So society gets all of these benefits. And the last step is to think about this. All right, so step 7. How prosperous is society at the private equilibrium, which we outlined in orange? And how about at the social equilibrium, which we have now given in blue triangles here? So conceptually, you want to think about the difference between those is basically what could society look like? How good could we have it? What might we achieve if we got this market right? In other words, if we move from Q star private to Q star social, there would be additional surplus to be gained. And the fact that we're stuck at Q star private in the absence of action, in the absence of government action, means that we have to give up something. We have to give up some of the benefit that would appear in blue because we're stuck at what's in orange. So I think from that, you can fairly clearly identify which of the little areas on this triangle is social loss. And that is the concept of externalities and social loss.